I'm Lucy. I'm Lucy. This is Kathe. I'll give Kathe a better introduction soon, but I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, which for me here in Nipaluna, Hobart, is the Muanina people of the Southeast Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty was never ceded. Wherever we are across Lutruwita, Truawana, Tasmania, I acknowledge that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement and respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are on the line. I think it's also appropriate, given today's topic, to acknowledge that on a daily basis, the Palawa and Pakana people in Tasmania and all of this country's First Peoples live with the consequences of Australia's failure to uphold their basic human rights and their rights as First People. We need to do better. So, welcome. Some housekeeping stuff. We have an interpreter here today, and instructions to keep Tanya on screen if you need the Auslan interpreter are in the chat. Please ensure your microphones are muted during the presentation, but we welcome you to leave your cameras on where you're comfortable to do so that we can see you in the same way that you can see us, and we can have a bit of a conversation together. You're probably all aware of how to use Zoom by now, but just in case you've been using other formats, to access the mute and chat functions, hover your mouse at the bottom of the screen to note where the chat and mute functions are. After a short presentation from Kathe here, we'll have a facilitated conversation. Please place your questions in the chat function whenever you like, and I will pose those questions to our speaker after she's presented. If I don't fully understand the question, I might call on you to unmute and clarify. If we don't get to all the questions, we'll follow up with Kathe afterwards. The session will be recorded today so that people who couldn't be here can catch up on the conversation, but your contributions through the chat will remain offline and anonymous. Thank you to all of those who have their cameras on already. It's great to see your faces, some of you enjoying lunches. Very glad to see you. So a bit of a topic intro. A few weeks ago, our previous colleague, Wyn Russell, who many of you will know, shared an article with the policy team at TasCOSS, a commentary in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Public Health titled Rethinking the Use of Vulnerable. In that commentary, author Stephanie Minari and colleagues argue the following. Widespread indiscriminate use of the term vulnerable is problematic. When used as a term to describe certain individuals or populations in a nondescript and vague manner, the reader fills in the blanks of why a certain individual or group is vulnerable. Being vulnerable could be seen as an intrinsic deficit, inferiority, or an inability to protect the individual's own best interests. This can, in turn, reduce both perceived and actual agency of the individual or group, depicting them as others who are powerless and in need of protection. This may also result in further stigmatization and exclusion of these individuals or groups. So upon reading out that article, our TasCOSS policy team reflected on the ongoing conversations about language that we've had on our policy work that aims to be inclusive, accurate, and to do no harm. First and foremost, we use people first language, which centers the human before any category or label. For us, this most commonly means using the phrase Tasmanians living on low incomes instead of low income Tasmanians, or Tasmanians experiencing vulnerability rather than vulnerable Tasmanians. We've also recently been trying to tease apart the nuanced differences between circumstances where someone is perceived as experiencing disadvantage versus vulnerability. This article disrupted those conversations by giving us a new perspective. Minari and colleagues proposed the need to be specific when using terms like vulnerable or disadvantaged. They propose an alternative, priority communities or individuals. They argue, priority communities are those that need particular attention or focus in the way of investment and resources to create a more equitable health status. Using the term priority rather than vulnerable places the emphasis on the system prioritizing communities rather than the community being vulnerable to the system. We wanted to explore the implications of this proposal in more detail, which prompted this policy conversation topic. And it seems with over 50 people registered from more than 30 organisations across sectors, other people have a keen interest in this topic too. And we look forward to hearing your perspectives later on today. First, to deepen our thinking, our guest speaker today argues that there's value in engaging in the language we already have, but in thoughtful and intentional ways. Dr. Katherine Robinson is a social researcher with the Social Action and Research Centre at Anglicare. She has a broad interest in the relationship between vulnerability, justice, and place. Katherine has a long-held commitment to qualitative research and advocacy in the areas of homelessness, complex trauma, and social care. Her current work focuses on understanding the experiences and support system needs of Tasmanian children and young people who experience high vulnerability. Thanks so much for joining us today, Katherine. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, and it's lovely to see many of you, meet some of you for the first time, even though it's through Zoom. And thank you to TasCOSS for inviting me to reflect on vulnerability with you all today, and to Lucy for the very kind introduction. I would like to acknowledge that my home place and workplace are on the lands of the Muanina people. I acknowledge that these lands were taken through war, were never ceded, and that acknowledging the vulnerability and associated violence of white belonging in Tasmania remains unfinished work in this state. So again, it's lovely to meet you all. And as Lucy has mentioned, I'm an academic and social researcher currently working in the Social Action and Research Centre of Anglicare Tasmania. SARC, as we're known, is a research and advocacy unit solely funded by Anglicare Tas. And our team of 6 works to address the social justice issues faced by low-income Tasmanians. We use high quality, in-depth research as the foundation for our advocacy. We provide social critique and work collaboratively to advocate for changes to the social beliefs, systems and practices which stand in the way of Tasmanians' just access to good and meaningful lives. So I've been invited to share just a short reflection on the concept of vulnerability. And it's certainly not an easy topic, especially after a second Pfizer vaccination. So I apologise in advance if that shows up. In our field of social care, what does it mean to describe those we serve as vulnerable? Is this a valuable or even ethical way to characterise those who we may be aiming to assist to flourish in the ways they want and need? Does the label or concept of vulnerable actually help those we might apply it to? What are the dangers of thinking about someone as vulnerable? What could be enabled by determining a person is vulnerable? Well, I'm going to immediately disappoint you by saying that I'm not putting myself forward as someone with the answers to these questions. Each one of us has to do the work of establishing a language that describes the populations we work with, that captures the strengths and weaknesses of any individual human experiences. I will say with surety that it's only through constant struggle, negotiation and revision that we're likely to come close to a just description or definition of people experiencing particular need. Or to put it another way, to offering a description or definition that delivers justice for people in need. As the concept or label of vulnerability has become embedded in the fields of social care and social policy over the last decade, whether we like it or not, we need to think carefully both about our use of it and how it's being employed by others in our own organisations, in political institutions, in policy development, in program and service design, research and evaluation. Thinking about what exactly vulnerability is and who or what is vulnerable is extremely important as it shapes how we respond to it. It shapes our resulting forms of practice and where and to whom we may pitch our advocacy. And again, while each of us will have a sense of whether the concept of vulnerability or of the vulnerable person is something that we even want to use ourselves, given its existence and extensive use across the industry, including social care policy and politics, we need to be questioning what this term can deliver for those it refers to. So guiding my thoughts today is this overarching question. Can vulnerability as a concept and label help us to progress the kinds of social justice agendas that may guide our various organisations, our politics, and indeed our individual work with people? My basic starting point is that in very general terms, the social care industry, broadly conceived, is not interested in every member of society at all times or even ever. For the most part, we're interested in certain people at certain points in their lives, and often when things go wrong. We are paid to develop and provide a safety net of care services for those who, for whatever multitude of reasons, do not have access to other formal and informal resources of care. And of course, we all require and are dependent on care. And in this sense, there is no invulnerable human. But our access to care resources, whether income, childcare, friends, family, or employment, is unevenly distributed. This means that while it's true that we are universally vulnerable, it is also true that some are more vulnerable than others. And I'll say more on that in a bit. So it's those who are more in need, or indeed most in need, who are the focus of social care work. Through history, this population has been labelled as the sick, the lame, the poor, the destitute, the disenfranchised, the marginalised, the unequal, the stigmatised, the excluded, the residualised, the downtrodden, the needy, the vulnerable. We need to be able to name those who matter to us most. But how do we best do this? My first observation is that any term used to describe human need can be toxic. For example, both the descriptors vulnerable and resilient have been resoundingly criticised for locating agency or personal power in the individual alone, as though regardless of need, challenge, illness, one need only a growth mindset to overcome vulnerability. So my second observation is that there is no best or fully just or most ethical way to characterise a human life or human need. What matters most are always our efforts to practice care and complexity in understanding the conditions which give shape to human life and need. Better understanding the conditions for livable life helps us in turn to think about the best way to shape or change those conditions so that folk can live the most rich and meaningful life they can. So where does this leave us with vulnerable as a term used to describe a population or cohort in need of social assistance? I'm going to talk a bit about how I think using the term, concept or label vulnerable can usefully help us come to grips with the personal vulnerability a human can experience and the social conditions that produce vulnerability. So that is to say that despite its risks, I really value the idea, I really value what the idea of vulnerability can bring to our multidisciplinary practices of social care. So on the value of vulnerable, I'd firstly say that now more than ever, we are being reminded about our universal vulnerability. Those COVID numbers tell us each day how vulnerable we are to each other. We all also enter universal periods of heightened vulnerability during gestation, birth, childhood, illness, injury, and older age. in which we're often wholly dependent on others, usually being kept alive through the unpaid domestic work of women. These women silently, miraculously appear to put in place an extensive infrastructure of 24-hour care. When an individual doesn't have access to a mother, wife, or daughter, our society and systems scramble about in shock and put social care systems such as out-of-home care, in-home care, and aged care into play. So I like thinking about what it is to be vulnerable, because this is what joins me to others and what makes me responsible for others. I need to take care of people in my community, as I likewise require the provision of care for my own survival. Where the obvious universal vulnerabilities of childhood, illness, and older age are solved for many by the unpaid work of women, it's hard to get past the brutal reminders of universal vulnerability offered by contemporary acts of terrorism, and of course, as I've mentioned, by COVID-19. We are universally interdependent and vulnerable as we breathe each other in. Secondly, I like thinking about what it is to be vulnerable, because when our society does a poor job of caring for each other, some people become more vulnerable than others, and they suffer greatly. I find no meaning in this. So to determine someone as vulnerable presses them into my consciousness. An ethical demand is made. A call for help is issued. Such a call can be ignored, but it cannot be unmade. And where this call cannot be unmade, it can continue to trouble and trouble and trouble. And a good example of this is the collaborative effort over the last few years to make the call for improved responses to unaccompanied homeless children. So this is all to accept that vulnerability is universal, but it's also unequally distributed and experienced. And this is an observation that has power to compel us to do better in our provision of care. Finally, vulnerability literally means openness to wounding. And the experience of heightened exposure to being wounded has been a central theme across my research career, which is focused on lived experiences of homelessness, mental ill health, violence, and complex trauma. So just to say, socially, this means that no one ever asks me about my work. So it's really nice to have some friends on the screen today. So I'm also drawn to the idea of vulnerability because it helps me hold on to the urgent bodily reality of wounding I consistently encounter in my research work. And it helps me think critically about the social conditions, systems, practices, relationships, which unequally distribute and inflict these wounds, whether these are wounds of malnutrition or psychological distress or assault and so on. So for me, to be vulnerable is not just about a lack of systemic access to care, but about the immediacy of individual harm and bodily and psychological damage this lack of care can result in. In both my research and advocacy, vulnerability has become an analytical frame to help me make sense of the openness to wounding some people experience more than others. It's helped me focus on their psychological or felt experience of this increased exposure to and likelihood of wounding, for example, in the context of rough sleeping. And it's helped me to focus on what is needed structurally and systemically to prevent this wounding from happening. For example, increased investment in housing first and social housing. So what can you take away from these brief thoughts? I've given a quick sense of 3 valuable interventions the idea of vulnerability can offer our work in the social care sector. 1, vulnerability is unique in that it is universal. We all have inherent vulnerability because we are human, and we all have capacity for intensified periods of vulnerability. Remembering our own vulnerability helps us to step back from the idea of vulnerability as a character flaw or personal weakness or the outcome of bad choice. 2, nonetheless, vulnerability is also unevenly distributed and unevenly intensified. And noticing this sets up an ethical call for the provision of social care and for the strengthening of our industry. And it also frames the high value of our sector in its provision of life-sustaining infrastructure. 3, vulnerability as openness to being wounded sets in train the urgency of systemic intervention and confronts us with the frightening bodily reality of deeply personal precarity. We need social, economic and system change, but we also need to provide relational care and support for individuals, including for ourselves. So when you encounter the idea of the vulnerable person in social policy, in social service tenders, in interpersonal dialogue, you can be thinking about what meaning of vulnerable is being assumed and who or what is assumed to be vulnerable. Is the term being used in a way which acknowledges the complexity and conditions of human experience? What elements of vulnerability are you being asked to respond to? Where does the vulnerability described seem to be coming from? Whilst I find complex understandings of vulnerability compelling, remember, naming the vulnerable offers no ethical guarantees of a good systemic or personal response, or indeed a response at all. But this applies to all terminology. But given the meaning of vulnerability, of who counts as vulnerable, is not fixed, what matters most is that we take every opportunity to challenge, expand and specify its use such that justice is more likely to be served than not. Thank you.
I loved that. I always get, yes, thank you on screen. I have had the pleasure of interacting with Kathe on a small number of instances, but every time I do, I learn something new and I come away feeling more challenged, which is a rare and valuable experience and one I really value. One of the things that jumps out to me is that I'll be the first to admit that I'm guilty of using vulnerable and vulnerability in vague and opaque ways. And what I've learned from this is that instead of trying to humanize those groups as needing a systemic response, I'm dehumanizing them by erasing their multiple identities and disconnecting them from the circumstances that have driven them into circumstances of vulnerability. And I really appreciate your reminder to remember our own vulnerability, and I'll take that forward because as someone who is queer and disabled, I experience vulnerability in different ways, and remembering that universality of vulnerability, I think, will help remind me to create a connection between the policy I write and the language I use and the communities I'm writing it for and with. So thank you for that, Kathe.
Pleasure.
Okay, well, pop your questions in the chat. We've got a few come through already. So I'll kick us off with a question from Mark, who comes from the Brain Injury Association of Tasmania, who asks, what impact does the media have on the word vulnerable? Are they educated about the use of the word?
well, having taught once in a communications degree, I'd like to think so. But I certainly wouldn't assume that. And I think that each one of us has a role to play in making sure that whenever we have the opportunity to answer questions or do media releases or interact with media, even informally, that we see each of those moments as an opportunity to educate. I wouldn't assume anything about the media. Again, all I can say to that is that it's our job to teach them.
Thanks, Kath. So our next question from Alex McKenzie, and this flows on quite nicely from opportunities for education. How do you think we can get those not currently thinking about vulnerability and the openness to wounding of others and us all to think about vulnerability? Is there something different we could be doing to get our leaders to think about it more? I immediately think of our Prime Minister referencing his need to reference his wife and daughters in order to understand vulnerability.
Oh, gosh, you guys.
And this reminds me a bit of the conversation we had where we were talking about the bureaucrats writing government policy using the word vulnerable because it's familiar, but perhaps not unpacking what it needs, so what it means.
Yeah, okay. So over a number of years, I'd say I've been quite privileged to have the opportunity, particularly in Tasmania, but also in my work in New South Wales, to be involved in policy writing processes and to be part of, I guess, kind of executive type meeting environments that involve ministers. And it's absolutely my belief that people working in those positions, for the most part, are deeply compassionate, sensitive, clever people. But somehow it's like the genre of policy writing, they feel as though they have to reproduce quite a limited vocabulary and understanding of the problems that they're trying to address through policy. And yet in themselves, they're actually lovely, intelligent, clever people. So somehow there's a kind of genre issue, I think. And that takes bravery for people to start writing policy and making new representations of people in, creative and different ways. But I think the humans are there who can do it. But giving them our support and collaboration and consistently feeding in new concepts and ideas. And then, of course, this goes right back to the education system and what kind of training. And I note the University of Western Australia is currently looking at axing their Department of Sociology. That worries me because it's precisely those kinds of disciplinary contributions, to our younger folk who then grow up to become the ministers, the policy writers of the future. We need to make sure they're getting exposed to critical social thinking and to new ways of thinking about and capturing social problems and social experience.
I think there's something that I've taken away from this that I feel like I can act on. And if I think about the way I learned to write policy, I got this job not really knowing what a policy officer did and never having really written a piece of social policy in my life. And the way I learned was through mentoring and mostly examples of reading other people's policy. So I think once you get kind of enculturated into that genre, you feel the need to write in that way because that's how it's always been done. But one thing that we can do is to start to write policy and write submissions and speak in different ways. So one thing that I want to move forward is that wherever I use the word vulnerable or vulnerability, I define specifically what circumstances and what systems are engaged in causing that vulnerability in ways that complexify and make it more specific rather than general and opaque and dehumanizing. And I think that the amount of people in this room as a sector, the ripple effects, if we lead by example in all of the work that we do, we have immense power to be able to push change in the people and the leaders that we want to see that change in.
I'd also say, just to add in, what creates good policy and good policy writing is the connection of those doing that writing with people who are living and feeling the experience or issue that is being written about. And I think I saw that really profoundly in work being done on Tasmania's first youth at risk strategy back in 2017, where a lot of work was put in by the people leading that strategic work to spend time with children and young people who were experiencing really high vulnerability. So just as a kind of starting point for me, it's always with people.
Yeah. I've just had a private message from Deborah, who I can't see the full name, Deb. And she's asked me, "Hi Lucy, didn't direct this to everybody. Interesting, we are talking about the use of the word vulnerable, yet you label yourself as disabled rather than a person living with disability. Would you care to talk about this?" Well, I'm very happy to make myself share my vulnerability in this situation. So labeling myself that way is an intentional choice. So I occupy the identity of being queer in my sexual orientation, and I label myself as a queer cisgendered woman. And that's a label I step into before my people because it's a big part of who I am. When I have an acquired disability, and it took me a long time to label myself or to own that identity. And I would often do that in a way that was, I'm a queer woman with a disability. And for me, that was about a shame I attached to having a disability and the stigmatization that society pushes on living with a disability. And so it was counterintuitive to me that the identity that I label myself as queer, and I'm a proud queer woman, that I was willing to put that as a label and the other as a situation. And that to me was a separation of one that I was proud of and one that I was ashamed of. And so as part of trying to overcome that societal stigmatization and not internalize it, I'm comfortable labeling myself as disabled, but that's a personal and political choice that I realize not everyone agrees with. And in our sector, I do encourage people first language. But thanks for asking that, Deb, and I hope that gives you a little bit of an insight into my psyche. The next one that comes up is from we'll go to one from Baden and then one from Scout. The one from Baden is a comment on our recent discussion about genre, saying the genre issue relates to the entrenched unconscious social presuppositions and devalue positions. The language represents deliberate blind spot strategies to allow such dual and contradictory beliefs. That's a lot of long words that I'll probably need a bit to think about.
Well, I think just in response to Baden, I'd say just in my interactions with government, state government policy writers here and in other jurisdictions, I never find anything as particularly deliberate, which is also a concern. But, as we've talked about before, we're not necessarily talking about administrative evil, although, of course, that's a possibility. I think it still is a problem with genre and word choice and feeling free to kind of be creative. And as I said, connected with the lived experience being described. And this applies exactly the same way to researchers as well, not just policy writers, that unless you're kind of deeply embedded in lived experience, from my point of view, then it's easier for you to start generalising and kind of floating above that experience. You're never going to be able to provide a really grounded and rich account. Yeah. There's a greater risk of providing a really superficial understanding and label of whatever cohort or issue that you're dealing with.
Yeah. So thank you for that kind of deep comment, Baden. I really appreciate that input. It'll give me something to think about after this as well. Scout from MRC asks, can we also talk about the overuse of the word resilient, for communities and people who are surviving multiple systems of oppression and marginalisation. A little anecdote from one job I left at a university where I'd filed a complaint about my boss bullying me fairly severely, and my boss's response was to send me to resilience training. So my response as an academic developer, where I teach other academics about inclusion approaches, was to pitch a development workshop for academic staff called Fuck Resilience: How to Advocate for Your Rights in the Workplace. Funnily enough, senior management didn't want to fund that as a workplace offering, but I'm with you, Scout. So Kath, do you want to just explain a little bit on your thinking about the word resilience?
Look, I'm a long hater of the word resilience, I'm afraid, because it just, to me, smacks of a kind of neoliberal sense of, look, you know, if you could just work harder and pull your socks up, then, you know, you really would be able to, you know, get that second home and rent it out and just live a better life. And it also kind of contains resilience inside an individual, and yet, you know, what we've been talking about is that, of course, humans are not sealed from each other. We rely on each other deeply. So if anyone's going to ever get more resilient, it's because together as a community, or in relationship with others or other systems, other people, it's through the strengthening of those relationships out of which resilience will come, not through some kind of, you know, internal mindfulness that may be able to transform your attitude into one that's more cheery and able to cope with bullying in your case. So look, that's slightly tongue-in-cheek, but that's certainly my position on resilience.
And I think it ultimately places the fault and the onus and the responsibility of systems of oppression on the individual rather than on the systems that are doing the oppressing. As you say, to just pull your socks up, or as Andrew from the Scarlet Alliance, resilience is a cover word for suck it up, which is pretty appropriate.
That's right. It does nothing to actually, you know, turn any eyes on the broader community, the systems and services that might be in place or might not be in place, as it's most likely to be. Yeah, it's directing all the attention to the individual, which is pointless.
Yeah. But also a risk we run if we use the word vulnerable in a way that makes the person inherently vulnerable and responsible for getting out of that vulnerable circumstance or becoming less vulnerable, if we don't acknowledge the systems that are meant to support and are failing that person. So I think that comes back to our kind of thesis here in terms of vulnerability as a valuable concept if it's done right in complex ways.
Yeah, so the same risks in using resilience, apply to using vulnerability. And as I said before, in the end, it doesn't matter what terminology is used. It's the complexity and care put in to developing a broad enough analysis of what's going on. That's the most important thing.
Yeah. Boshra asks, is there evidence out there to describe how those targeted by the label vulnerable in social care programs identify with that label or see themselves as such? Great question. Thank you, Boshra.
Yeah. Yes, I think it's fairly limited, but, you know, as you can imagine, lots of people are not happy with that at all. They don't understand themselves as being vulnerable. And in part, that's because of the way in which vulnerability has been defined in the first place, you know, in terms of kind of individual weakness or deficit. And that's why continued work on critiquing and expanding how vulnerable is understood could lead to a more inclusive and useful use of that term.
Yeah. And I mean, it's always useful to ask as well, if you're writing something and co-creating some policies or some documents for a particular audience who will be consuming those resources, it's worth co-creating the language and fact-checking it with those people, I think, to integrate and make sure that they see themselves reflected in a way that isn't dehumanizing or alienating.
And as I said earlier, it's being used. So whether people like it or not, it is being used in policy and service and program design and so on. So again, the responsibility comes back to us to keep pushing the boundaries of what is understood and included when that label or term is used.
Yeah. Lauren asks, the concept of vulnerability doesn't stand alone. It's often embedded in a narrative of paternalism and social control. It may be easier to be brave when working with clients or writing government policy, but how to upend these concepts in grant applications in this sector, especially for philanthropic dollars? Great question.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I don't have the answer to that. I mean, I guess all you can do is keep pointing out the need to not simply focus on the individual experiencing the problem of concern that service tender is supposed to address, but to be pointing out what other relationship building or interagency connections or cross-service connections need to be made to respond. That's a pretty hopeless answer, but that's about as good as I've got.
Well, and we won't have all the answers because we have so much knowledge in the room. If anybody else has a response to Lauren's question, we would love for you to share it by just popping it in the chat. We can have a conversation there as well as here at the same time.
I reckon, I mean, there are opportunities, like tenders don't just come out of nowhere. There are always backroom conversations. You know, again, the best tenders are going to arrive out of a culture of collaboration between providers and government. And so again, it's part of our responsibility to make sure we're really engaging in those relationships, using those opportunities like one might with media, to keep educating and pushing a version of the key issues as you're experiencing them closer to the ground than government will be.
Yes. Jenny says, reading the article reminded me to think about the required system changes for recent national departmental discussions. I gave feedback on a proposed program that focused only on achieving individual outcomes, not including any recognition of need for increased social security payment rates that have an impact on people's vulnerability. Do you have a thought in response to that comment?
Well, nothing other than to say that's a kind of the example of the limited use or application of the idea of what it is to be vulnerable, that I think there's also an opportunity to work against that. We don't have to accept that. In practice we may, but you know, like we're talking long-term social change here. And again, given vulnerability or the vulnerable has become a placeholder in policy, we just need to keep working on broadening how it's understood, what it means, where it points to the change that's needed, i.e. not just in the individual, but in the kinds of social conditions that give rise to what that individual actually comes to experience.
Yeah. So the next comment comes from Jeddah. I'm not sure after reading the supplied paper and listening to the discussion if I am as comfortable with the term vulnerable, even when specified, because it does seem that it more than often is a term that is unspecific and diffuse. Additionally, vulnerable is so individualized in that there is nothing inherently wrong with a vulnerability, but instead the harm that comes with a relational interaction or a lack of interaction, e.g. ignoring the ethical call for care. I would like to see a term that actually not only highlights this relational nature of harm, but also calls more directly to those who can or do harm, rather than calls more specifically to how someone is vulnerable. So I think that kind of, I agree, and I really appreciate your reflection there, Jeddah, and that kind of ties in with the argument that the Marani article makes about arguing for priority, which places the onus on the systems to prioritize people who need access to services rather than on the people for needing the help themselves. Maybe you can respond a little bit to your thoughts about if we're not comfortable, say hypothetically, we're not comfortable with using vulnerable, and we want to push for a different term, what you think about priority or other terms that you've heard, or why you think we should stay on the vulnerability bandwagon.
Well, firstly, vulnerability and vulnerable are in use. And so for me, it's about broadening and making more complex the use of that term. And because I think it has an ethical call, and because on the point of relationality, that's precisely what vulnerability encompasses in a way that priority doesn't. Priority is just a dead word to me. I don't find it ethically compelling. It's not universal, and it still leaves us with the question of, okay, so they are priority. Why? Because they're vulnerable. Well, what does vulnerable mean? So we kind of, you know, again, all I can say is that in many ways it doesn't matter what terms are used. It's what understanding of the best way to respond to human need or human suffering informs action that's going to matter. But just for me personally, I do find the term vulnerable and vulnerability compelling because they speak to a shared experience at the same time as acknowledging, well, of course, there are people who are more vulnerable than others. So I think I actually like the fact that it's not a term that's kind of contained. It gives us room to work it and to push those boundaries out to have a much more kind of inclusive sense of what or who is vulnerable, which in my view, again, would include the systems, services, community, political leaders, and our need to examine where vulnerability lies there as much as with an actual individual who's suffering or who's in need.
Yeah, thanks for that response. A comment in the chat from Lauren suggests that she sees potential in Judith Butler's use of precarity as an alternative to vulnerable, giving us some food for thought. Liv Hogarth from Working It Out picks up the earlier discussion of resilience, asking, what about describing people as resilient when they have actually demonstrated survival in a world and system that is against them as a historical descriptor, for example, LGBTIQ plus people in decades past?
What do I think of that? Or
well, I mean, I described myself as resilient when we first met, when I objected to being labelled vulnerable by somebody who didn't understand my circumstances. And part of me sees this as like a reclamation of a word that has been destroyed by senior managers mostly. No offense to senior managers in the room, that's just my bias coming through. But I do see that in certain processes that as an individual, I've been resilient and I'm okay with that language when I divorce it and reclaim it from the way that it's been used to continue to oppress people. So that's kind of my response to Liv's discussion there, is that like vulnerable, it can have a history of oppressing and hurting and causing harm, but it can also be reclaimed in certain contexts to be used as the original definition defines as, I don't know what the definition is, but I imagine it's something like surviving in a system that is meant to harm you, or, you know, that kind of context.
Yeah, no, I mean, that makes sense to me, but it's also the case that where people are strong, when you kind of dig into that, there are snippets of other people there too, that's being resilient or being strong doesn't come from nowhere. There will always be others implicated in that. And so I always like to think of these things as shared, and what am I trying to say? It's not simply because I'm a really strong person that I can survive. There will be others. It's because of particular input from others or context that it has also helped me to survive.
So a holistic view again. Anthony Gubbin asks, in regards to resilience, is it wise to always externalize it and suggest that issues are always systemic? Doesn't this take away some of the individual responsibility to make changes? I feel it can be easy to always blame society, but people have a level of self-ownership to move beyond their circumstances.
And this goes straight back to Liv's comment too. And again, it's not either. It's both, right? So there's always going to be individual agency that is connected to the social conditions that actually make that agency or action or survival possible. So I think it's when we try and either turn all our attention to social conditions and bear no attention to the power or indeed weakness of the individual. That's a problem. And it's also a problem the other way around, where we might seek to kind of blame the individual, put a lot of pressure on the individual to somehow be independent, when in fact, in reality, we live in constant interdependence with multiple others and things and objects and animals and so on.
Yeah. Joe from Speak Out says, do you have any ideas on how to keep furthering these kinds of conversations heading into the future? For example, I study at UTAS at the moment, and to do electives in sociology and social justice type units, the cost is double than 2 years ago. How can we highlight to those higher up that systematically critical thinking is important now and ongoing? There seems to be less and less importance placed on societal problems in education.
Yeah. Look, I'm depressed about this at the moment, so I've got no particular cheery offering to make, and I also feel bad as a recovering academic myself. I did my 13 years of teaching in the social inquiry program at UTS, teaching on social suffering and social problems. But yeah, the future of that, I don't know. Some are talking of the kind of end of the university system as we know it. It's certainly, you know, I'm 45, don't tell anyone, and the kind of university system that I went through, I was no longer able to reproduce that as an academic myself. Things had changed already in my own generation. But, you know, we can always remain hopeful, and there's wonderful knowledge being produced out there still. There's incredible thinkers, Judith Butler, many, many, many others. They are still leading these debates. And so, I don't know, keep up the fight, keep reading, and lots of informal conversations and places like this as well, but also tea room type conversations. In your own workplace, to set up a little lunchtime forum. That's what we did in SARC, where someone's kind of come across something interesting and just set aside 30 minutes, 40 minutes to come together and just break out of the normal humdrum to just have a conversation.
Yeah.
Sadly, I think that's become quite a rare thing, both within the academic world and outside of it.
I like the term recovering academic. As someone who's 7 months semi out of the system, I definitely feel that. And I do love the idea. So I used to survive universities through setting up like critical thinking reading groups, Joe. We had one on feminist literature, for example, when I was at the University of Edinburgh, and the purpose was that we would read a short thing and come to discuss, and there was no agenda, there wasn't a drive, it was just a critical conversation. And I do think there's huge power in those kinds of communities of practice, and great opportunities for peer mentoring, both up and down across levels of the systems that we work in. And those informal conversations just have boundless opportunity for change, I think. So we can't underestimate the value of that kind of conversational change.
Yeah.
Nita picks up on the impact of labelling, saying it has been evident during the pandemic with labelling all over 65s as vulnerable. She says it has been very disappointing for seniors and also promotes the attitude that seniors are a burden on society.
See, I'm in two minds about this because I have parents who are over 65 and I want them to get vaccinated. I mean, luckily they have, but, you know, theoretically. And if calling people vulnerable is what it takes and there is an ethical valency or urgency in doing so, then I think there's a place for that. In terms of older people being disappointed, if I'm just interpreting that question right, being disappointed about being understood as vulnerable. Again, if we were working with broader understandings of vulnerability, then we'd all know that we're all a burden to society. And that is the nature of being human. There's no other way to be. We are all burdens at pretty much all times, but obviously at particular times. And I guess normalizing that and accepting that that's actually what being human is. Yeah, it's our job to keep kind of reproducing that kind of narrative.
Scout has a comment along those lines that I'd like to share as we head into the kind of end of this conversation. Unfortunately, I'm really enjoying myself. I think these terms still have use, as long as we take care to define them and don't rely on them as a shortcut. We understand vulnerability as often created by systems of inequality, and we understand resilience isn't just a superpower, which means that people in power don't need to change the status quo. I really agree with that, and that's a reminder that I'll definitely take forward in my policy writing and my conversations to try and define and be specific and complexify the terms so that they're not just shortcuts. And I think if, as a sector, from everyone in this room has many networks, we can take that lesson forward and see ourselves as agents of change around using language that is empowering and caring, rather than dehumanizing and alienating. Then we have great capacity to lead the kind of change that we want to see.
And that points to the power of individual experience, whether that's an experience of suffering or surviving or indeed thriving, alongside also pointing to what it is about the social conditions that that person's living in that enables them to flourish or continues to perpetuate harm.
Yeah. Okay. We're 2 minutes out. So I'm going to wrap it up on that note. I've got a huge amount of things to think about, and I hope that you all have gained something, even if that something is more questions than answers. I think that the questions are what drive us forward. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our interpreter, Tanya. They've done a fantastic job today, so thank you so much. A little round of applause for Tanya. A huge thanks to Liam, who has been feeding and structuring me questions so that within my limited cognitive capacity today, I don't have to split my attention. That's been wonderful. And to Bridget, who's been in the background quietly doing all the tech and making it go seamless. There she is. Thanks, Bridget. And of course, a huge thanks to Kathe. I have had such a great time today and learned so much. So thank you for your time and your preparation and your thoughtfulness.
Thank you for having me, and lovely to talk with you all.
If you have more questions, please send them through. You've got my email in the invite and online. We're happy to engage after this. And if you've got an idea for a future policy conversation, we would love to hear it. So send them through to us. We're happy to keep the conversation going. All right. Thanks, everyone.